World War II started relatively quietly for Admiral Cunningham after his cup of tea. Of course, he was stationed in the Mediterranean, and at the start of the war it was France and the British Empire versus Germany, and with no Goeben equivalent, the Mediterranean stayed fairly calm, albeit a little bit tense, and everyone was of course waiting to see what move the Italians would make. The only major immediate change was that convoys were immediately introduced across the Mediterranean, which was something Cunningham thought was a bit of a waste of time and resources. He argued that, given the enclosed nature of the sea, it would have been better to concentrate a lot of anti-submarine assets in the Strait of Gibraltar to stop the U-boats getting through in the first place. But by the end of September, it seemed quite clear that Italy wasn't about to jump in just yet, and so anti-contraband patrols were put in place with what ships he had left. For around about the same time, Cunningham's well-trained Mediterranean fleet was slipping through his fingers as the demands of war called ships away to other stations. This avalanche started with 1st Cruiser Squadron and some of his destroyers being withdrawn. With them went the last coherent force of 8-inch cruisers the Royal Navy would operate in the Mediterranean for quite some time, barring a few singletons. Then the battleships were called away bit by bit, along with the carrier Glorious. By the end of October, even Warspite had received her marching orders, bound for Norway, and Cunningham was not only left without much of a fleet, he was also lacking in a capital-grade flagship. This left him with two problems. Firstly, a large number of families of the various ships' crews had been left behind without any direct support from their husbands, which was a problem since instant bank transfers for the common man were not quite a thing yet. Cunningham's wife and niece therefore marshalled the better-off officers' wives, and between them they set about establishing a support system for the less well-off regular sailors' families. The other issue was where Cunningham himself should be located. Alexandria was favoured by him, as it would make liaison with the RAF and Army commanders, both of whom were stationed in Cairo, much easier. But it would take a while to build up a secure comms network and work out where all of his staff would physically live, since previously this would have been handled aboard Warspite. Conversely, the communications and accommodation infrastructure was already very well set up in Malta, the historic home of the Mediterranean Fleet, but this would mean that contact with the RAF and Army in North Africa could be by telegram and radio only. The Admiralty made the decision to send Cunningham to Malta, partly to avoid the headache of setting up another command station in Alexandria, but also because it was much closer to the French naval headquarters, with whom, of course, the Royal Navy was to cooperate. Also shrinking was his list of subordinate flag officers, as Vice Admiral Leighton had been recalled home with the cruisers. This left him with the then Rear Admirals Tovey and Moore. Poor Tovey, who had lately been in command of several flotillas of destroyers, now had as the sum total of his command the newly arrived Royal Australian Navy Scrap Iron Flotilla. Valiant ships, but still only 5 strong. By the end of the year, this and a trio of World War I-era C-class cruisers were all that was left to Cunningham, who found himself in Malta listening to a steady stream of reports coming out of the Atlantic and the North Sea. Instead of sailing around, he found himself instead keeping abreast of the diplomatic situation with the Turks and planning for a possible German advance through the Balkans. And by the end of the year, he was also having to point out to the Admiralty that, whilst the Mediterranean fleet was barely even the Mediterranean Squadron at this point, the Marine Nationale's resources in the area were almost the same as they had been at the start of the war, and as a result, if the situation persisted, the French might well have a point in demanding primacy of command for the Mediterranean, as they would at this point be committing by far the greater force to it. Back on Malta, he discovered multitasking ran in the family. His niece had found the time to help out the left-behind sailors' families in Malta just as much as he had in Alexandria, as well as working in the cryptographic office and getting engaged to her uncle's flag lieutenant. He would unfortunately be lost a year and a half later, after they'd been married, whilst serving as second in command of HMS Juno when that ship was bombed and sunk off of Crete. Given that they were based at Malta at the end of 1939, Cunningham found it somewhat amusing that at the time this Lieutenant, Starkey, had a direct ancestor who had been the secretary to the Grand Master of the Knights of St. John when the island was being besieged by the Ottomans in 1565. His distant descendant was now in almost an identical position. 1940 dawned, and the Mediterranean fleet received what Cunningham described as most unwelcome reinforcements. Two large liners, the Ranpura and Antenor, which had been converted to armed merchant cruisers ostensibly for use on contraband patrol. They were far too large, very fuel-hungry, and for all that still somewhat slow. Given their carrying capacity, Cunningham felt they could be used much better elsewhere, and fortunately they were recalled after a few weeks, much to the rest of the Mediterranean fleet's relief. By February 1940, diplomatic progress with Turkey meant a trip back to Alexandria. The town-class cruiser HMS Birmingham was on its way back to the Mediterranean fleet and would provide the requisite transport. The conference itself was mainly dealing with how the Anglo-French forces would, in a twist of irony, help the Turks defend the Dardanelles from the Germans, if the latter marched through the Balkans. This took up much of the first third of 1940 and gradually seemed to head towards some kind of agreement on a plan of action should the worst occur. In the meantime, a steady series of updates from Admiral Pound back in the UK kept the Mediterranean fleet appraised of the progress of the war in Europe. With the initial surge of activity at the outbreak of the war over, and with intelligence indicating the Italians might be about to throw their lot in, a number of slower-moving ships were already en route back to the Mediterranean by April, and Cunningham received two more bits of welcome news within days of each other. Firstly, after current operations were over, he'd probably be given Warspite back, and then dispatches regarding the final Battle of Narvik detailed exactly what Warspite had been getting up to on those operations. Warspite was but one of a steady stream of returning ships. A cruiser squadron, various destroyers, some elements of the Marine Nationale, and the battleships Malaya, Royal Sovereign, and Ramillies were soon to join Warspite in the eastern Mediterranean. Cunningham seems to have gotten on very well with Admiral Esteva, his opposite number in the Marine Nationale at this point, who revealed the plan if Italy entered the war was to join in operations in the Mediterranean with Dunkirk, Strasbourg, 4 heavy and a number of light cruisers, plus over a dozen destroyers, which would occupy Italian attention in the west. This alone, not counting the older French battleships, some of which were being assigned to Alexandria, or what would be the soon-completed battleship Richelieu, would give the Allies a significant advantage in the Mediterranean, where the Italian battleship force at this point consisted of only the 2 Convoys and the Littorio. This would of course change later in the year as Vittorio Veneto was just about to commission and the Duilio was just coming out of her modernisation, although Andrea Doria would be in dock until almost the end of the year. But in the time it would take for the first 2 of these ships coming back into service to work up, more Allied warships could be brought in. It was also time for Cunningham himself to move back to Alexandria, as now there was a substantial Mediterranean fleet again, and whilst the Admiralty had liked Malta for its pre-existing command and control facilities, the simple fact was that the fleet could only really be based in Alexandria if hostilities with Italy were genuinely being contemplated. Arriving back in Alexandria, he met the commander of the French forces that had been dispatched there. These were the older French battleships, along with their escorts. Vice Admiral Godefroy was in charge, and Cunningham thought extremely highly of him, and got on along quite well with him. That relations between the Royal Navy and Marine Nationale were generally good is something that's repeatedly encountered in this phase of the war. Even as the Germans advanced through the Netherlands and Belgium and then began to enter France, Admiral Esteva, now based over in Toulon with the French heavy cruisers, but whose house was in Rheims, which was currently under attack, sent Cunningham a letter which read in part, "If our house and all our goods are destroyed, we know that many people are to be severely ruined or hurt, and that it is an honour to suffer for the high ideals of civilization and not agree with the coarse brutality of those criminal Germans anxious to rule the whole earth." Meanwhile, more ships were arriving. HMS Leander, soon to be HMNZS Leander, and her near sister HMAS Sydney also pulled in, the latter soon to demonstrate the fighting spirit of the Royal Australian Navy, as much as the scrap iron flotilla would, with other ships also arriving. A quiet evacuation of the fleet's families from Malta was also underway, in part carried out by ships that were transiting through to Alexandria, although Cunningham's wife declared that she would remain behind to organise this evacuation, as she had decreed it not fit or proper for the Commander-in-Chief's wife to be on the first available ship leaving, with so many other families present. Unfortunately, none of the reinforcements dispatched had flight decks, and correspondence between the Admiralty and Cunningham was clear. Both parties were keenly aware of the need to provide fighter cover over a fleet, even if this meant that the fleet might not have any airborne strike capability. But at this stage, every aircraft and every flat top was needed elsewhere. The news from Europe, of course, was getting worse. The Germans were well into France, the British Expeditionary Force and numerous French troops were being evacuated from Dunkirk, and in the words of Cunningham, it seemed it was only a matter of days before the hyena Mussolini came in to share the carcass. A large floating dry dock had arrived in Alexandria, but supplies of ammunition for the fleet and anti-aircraft guns for both Malta and Alexandria were still low, although the 15-inch armed monitor HMS Terror had been concealed in the Grand Harbour at Malta, with spotters in the old castles looking out to sea as something of a nasty surprise for any seaborne assault on Malta. Messages were received that if Italy attacked Greece, the Anglo-French fleet was to move to immediately occupy Crete and Milos, but otherwise, if Italy entered the war without attacking Greece, they would await further instructions. Cunningham thus prepared his operational plan according to the forces he had available. With the army not having any immediate plans to invade Libya, and with a limited number of aircraft, submarines and destroyers, he aimed to secure the eastern Mediterranean, but not immediately move against Italian supply and communication lines between Italy and Libya, which would mean contesting the central Mediterranean, which he felt he could only afford to do via periodic sweeps with the combined Anglo-French fleet. The government appears to have at first thought this decision was too defensive, but luckily Admiral Pound interceded in London and pointed out that it was about the most that could be expected to be done with the resources the Mediterranean fleet had at the time, whilst he also let Cunningham know privately that if the latter made enough noise about it, Pound should be able to get the carrier Illustrious sent out to him sooner rather than later, which would help matters somewhat. There then followed a brief period of internal struggle in London, as Churchill tried, as he had in the opening days of the First World War, to micromanage the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean, whilst the Admiralty, well aware of the likely consequences of this, did their best to dissuade him and allow the commander on the scene to actually pass judgment on what he could and would do. Contending with a shortage of almost everything apart from battleships, there was also the worry that, with the constant stream of Italian ships sailing through the Suez Canal, the declaration of war might well come in the way of a block ship or a bomb ship, severing that vital transport and resupply link. Indeed, Cunningham would later reflect he wasn't entirely sure why the Italians didn't do that. But by June, the fleet in Alexandria had the aforementioned 4 battleships, along with 5 modern and 4 older light cruisers of varying classes, and about 24 Royal Navy destroyers, plus the scrap iron flotilla and a dozen submarines. Their first carrier, the Old Eagle, was on its way from the China station. 2 of the older French battleships had headed back to the western Mediterranean, which left the Allied French force with the old battleship Lorraine, 3 heavy and 1 light cruisers, and 3 small destroyers. Of these, the cruisers, although somewhat of the older examples of their type, would probably be the most useful going forward. And then, on June the 10th, World War II came to the Mediterranean, with the Italian declaration of war. First blood came half an hour before midnight when the wonderfully named destroyer HMS Decoy depth-charged a surface submarine. Dawn revealed a rather long oil slick, although it doesn't seem to have resulted in the sinking of the submarine in question, only its damaging. That isn't to say Allied anti-sub efforts were ineffective. The Regia Marina would be down 10 submarines by the end of the month in exchange for 3 British ones. A few hours later, Warspite, Malaya, and the freshly arrived Eagle sailed with escorts to sweep the North African coast, whilst the French cruisers cleared out the Aegean Sea. On the one hand, the Regia Aeronautica seemed to have missed the memo about being at war, but the Regia Marina certainly hadn't. The cruiser Calypso was torpedoed and sunk by a submarine on the 12th. A cheerful and cordial message arrived from Malta, where the RAF Commodore asked permission to unbox and assemble the 4 spare Sea Gladiators that were present there. These aircraft were due to have been picked up by Eagle, But since Malta had no fighter defence at the time, and the Regia Aeronautica had finally woken up and started bombing the place, and given that Eagle wasn't likely to risk the voyage to Valletta anytime soon, Cunningham gladly gave permission for their use, whereupon the aircraft would go on to form their own legend. About a month later, a message was received from some desk-bound officer in the Admiralty demanding to know why the Fleet Air Arm aircraft had been handed over to the RAF. This message was duly filed in the Admiral's fireplace. By June 20th, the Mediterranean Fleet escorted the battleship Lorraine over to Bardia for a bombardment mission, whilst a destroyer sweep backed up by French cruisers ran along the coast. However, this would be the last combat deployment of the French force at Alexandria, as the situation in mainland France was deteriorating fast. Initially, the French forces seemed to trust what would eventually become known as the Vichy government, but this was not universal even from the start. One of the French destroyers made it quietly known that, if necessary, they would be happy to take down the tricolour and hoist the white ensign if it meant they could continue the fight. This sentiment seemed to be fairly widely shared amongst the younger regular crew and the younger officers, whilst a number of the reservists and the older officers wanted to go back to France. And Cunningham thought there was a chance that he might be able to arrange for the ships, and any crew who wanted to stay behind, to be left to his care. But even if he had to evacuate all the French crewmen, he thought he had enough men spare to at least man the destroyers and one of the French heavy cruisers. By the 24th, France had signed an armistice, and Cunningham woke up feeling somewhat depressed, although he was soon cheered up by Admiral Tovey, who, being a student of history, had worked out that Britain had won almost every war where it had ended up at some point with all its allies taken out, and reminded his superior officer of this fact in light of their current situation. 4 days later, thanks to aerial reconnaissance, a trio of Italian destroyers were pursued, and one, the Espero, was sunk. But with only 800 spare 6-inch rounds in stock in Alexandria, the expenditure of shells by Liverpool and Gloucester to sink the one destroyer was drawing their reserves down to almost nothing. As the month ended, the issue of what to do with the French ships in Alexandria came into focus. The Admiralty, of course, was planning Operation Catapult to try and deal with all French ships at the same time, whether they be ships in UK ports, the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir, or the ones in Alexandria. And they wanted to ensure that Cunningham dealt with the ships in Alexandria at the same time as the ships in the other locations. They therefore asked Cunningham for his views on how to deal with the whole thing, with the minimum amount of lost lives and hostilities. Cunningham, in turn, was strongly against any sort of preemptive assault without warning, or seizure without warning, and instead pressed for negotiations. He therefore sent the following message back to the Admiralty on the morning of June the 30th. I cannot see what benefit is to be derived from forcible seizure of ships in Alexandria, and am most strongly opposed to the proposal. Request urgent consideration of the following points. 1. Apparently, the situation at Alexandria is quite different from that elsewhere in the Mediterranean. 2. If ships are to be seized, what is the object? If it is to prevent the ships falling into enemy hands, that has already been achieved. 3. I am convinced that the French would resist most strongly, so that if it is desired to obtain the ships for our own use, it is unlikely to be achieved by forcible seizure. Such action would be more likely to result in the ships being scuttled at their moorings, a harbour filled with wrecks, and unnecessary British and French casualties. 4. Moreover, the effect is likely to be disastrous in the Middle East, particularly in the Suez Canal and at Djibouti, where French cooperation is vitally important, and in Syria, whose friendly attitude is very necessary. 5. On the other hand, it is quite likely that if things are allowed to go on as they are, the ships may drop into our hands under pressure of lack of pay and food. 6. However, this appreciation makes no allowance for the repercussions which would follow the use of force at Oran, aka Mers el-Kabir. I am strongly opposed to such action there if it can possibly be avoided. I am not in full possession of the facts, but may remark on that the whole of the friendly French element may be alienated, and in particular I would mention the effect in North Africa, where friendly attitudes may greatly affect naval operations later on. And 7. No reports on French ships at Sfax have reached me. Request information. Owing to critical ammunition shortage, I am unwilling to engage my cruisers in action except against the enemy. The Admiralty replied that they would ideally like to obtain the French ships for the Royal Navy's use without bloodshed, and that any French crew who chose to fight on would be given the same pay and conditions as their equivalent ranks in the Royal Navy. Any others could be repatriated to France. If this was not possible, then ideally the ships would remain in Alexandria with skeleton crews and in a non-seagoing condition, with the understanding the Royal Navy would take them into service if the Italians or Germans broke the armistice conditions. In this arrangement, the United Kingdom would pay for the upkeep and maintenance of the ships, including any remaining crew's wages. If the French insisted on demilitarizing their ships in port, then this was also acceptable. However, if none of these outcomes were possible, then the ships were to be sunk at sea. July the 2nd was spent letting the rest of the Mediterranean fleet know what was about to happen and making preparations for the worst, if they needed to seize the French ships by boarding, or if a full-scale gun battle was going to erupt in the harbour. Admiral Godefroy was invited to come aboard Warspite at 0700 the following day, which he agreed to do, and in the meeting that followed, Cunningham passed on the Admiralty's requests, emphasising that they ideally wanted to have the French fight on alongside them. Godefroy made no comment to this other than to say that he would have preferred it if he'd had similar instructions from his own government as well. Once he had fully read the British government's demands, including that they needed a reply that day, the French admiral had a number of objections. He said he couldn't possibly accept any option without consulting his own government, who would be a few hours behind Alexandria time, and that his ships, if they were to fight on, must do so under the French flag. He was also concerned that if he put his ships back into the fight, the Germans and Italians would demand the use of other French ships still maintained in mainland French ports. Cunningham pointed out that although he didn't want to, the British could broadcast the terms of the Admiralty's offer over the harbour tannoy to the entire French fleet at anchor and see what the majority of the crew decided, which Godefroy confessed he did know and he had no power to prevent. Rereading the ultimatum, Godefroy appears to have come across the part about reducing his ships to skeleton crews, which somehow he appeared to have overlooked the first time round, and this had left him with the impression that his choices were to join the Royal Navy or sink his ships. He seemed much happier once he realised this other option, and he asked until about 11:30 to think it over. Bear in mind, this is Alexandria time. He was hesitant over removing most of the crews from his ships, as he was apparently very hopeful that the Italians would do something stupid that broke the armistice, and thus, if his crews were still on board, they could get back into action immediately. Unfortunately, not only did Italy stick to the terms of the armistice for the following few hours, but word of the unfolding tragedy at Mers el Kabir, or some version of it, reached Godefroy in the intervening time, and by noon a letter arrived. Whilst Godefroy and Cunningham had spoken in English earlier, this letter was now in French, and stated, using quite a few words, that he could not allow his ships to fight with the Royal Navy, and he must therefore sink his vessels instead, unless he was permitted to consult the French Admiralty, at which point he promised he would attempt to convey a desire to reduce the ships to a disarmed state in port. If he was not permitted this communication with his superiors, then he would have to revert back to sinking his ships. In a separate communication directly to Cunningham, he asked for 48 hours' grace in order to make arrangements for his crews. Cunningham replied, "My instructions leave me with no alternative but to accept your choice to take your ships to sea and sink them in open waters. I am prepared to accept the delay of 48 hours during which you are making arrangements for the safety and transport of your ship's companies, and will gladly facilitate any action you wish taken in this respect. I am therefore under the painful necessity of asking you to proceed to sea to carry out your purpose at 12 noon on Friday, July the 5th. Unfortunately, the British government wanted the whole issue sorted by nightfall, and Cunningham personally was convinced that if he could get Godefroy back onto option 2, at disarming the ships in port, then sooner or later the French ships and their crews and officers would sail together with the British again, whereas if they were sunk, then they would be of no further benefit to either France or Britain. Therefore, Cunningham wrote to Godefroy in a personal capacity, and suggested a compromise. If the French could make some kind of gesture, which he could then report back to the Admiralty, this might buy them time. He suggested perhaps starting to discharge the French ship's fuel oil or beginning to land the ship's torpedoes, both of which were long processes to organise that required extensive preparations, but which could also be relatively easily undone. This Godefroy accepted, and Cunningham duly signalled to London that the French were in the process of disarming their ships, with the subtext of, "So leave us alone." However, partially due to things gradually going from bad to worse at Mers El Kebir, and a degree of backseat driving, the Admiralty sent a follow-up signal which read, "Admiralty note that oil fuel is being discharged by French ships. Reduction of crews, especially by ratings, should however begin at once by landing or transfer to merchant ships, before dark tonight. Do not, repeat, not fail." As Cunningham himself would note in his autobiography, it is a perfect example of the type of signal which should never have been made. Apart from being quite unhelpful, it showed no comprehension whatever of the explosive atmosphere at Alexandria or the difficult conditions in which we were working. It filled me with indignation. Moreover, while ordering us to take action before dark, it was sent off from the Admiralty at a time which was after sunset in Alexandria. As it was impossible to implement, we ignored it completely. At the time, I did not believe the signal emanated in the Admiralty, and I do not believe it now, i.e., this had been ordered by the politicians. He then assembled all of his flag officers aboard Warspite, told them what was going on, and that he was going to burn the latest Admiralty signal, to the unanimous agreement of his officers. This decision was borne out quite quickly when, as they were talking, a letter arrived from Admiral Godefroy. "Admiral, I have just learned that an ultimatum has been addressed to our Atlantic fleet by the British Admiralty." This was the Mers El Kebir situation. "On the other hand, my Admiralty has ordered me to sail, though I have demanded to be assured that the order is authentic. I have replied that sailing is impossible, but that the situation is definitely changing. So that I may not incur reproach for having discharged oil fuel after receiving an order to sail, I have stopped the discharge of oil fuel pending events. But that changes nothing. I give you my word as to my intentions, which remain unchanged from those which I expressed to you in writing this morning." Despite further attempts at negotiation, nothing could be done to change the French admiral's mind further. With a direct order from France to proceed to sea, using force if needed, he would not discharge any more fuel nor remove any of his men. He also made it clear that he would no longer sink his ships in deep water, and that, if allowed out of Alexandria, his ships would make a run for France, even if this meant a running fight with the Mediterranean fleet. It might seem foolish to advise your potential enemy of this, but you have to remember that Godefroy seemed, according to Cunningham, to be doing his best to thread the needle of complying with direct orders from France, at least the letter of them, but in the least helpful way to Vichy, and the most helpful way that his honour would allow to his friends in the Royal Navy. This was further borne out when, despite officially stating his intention to sail, he sent an officer to book up suites in a local hotel, and he then sent another message that, if any demands were made of him, backed up by force, he would of course scuttle his ships in the harbour, but with a verbal addition by the messenger that this would be in as convenient a place for further naval operations by the British as possible. Due to the pressures on the situation from both admiralties, Cunningham now found himself with three choices. He could try and board and seize the French ships, he could open fire with guns and torpedoes, or he could demand the ships be interned or surrendered. This would of course force them to be scuttled. He immediately dismissed the first two options and so sent a message back to London stating that he would undertake the last option on the morning of the 5th, which was about 36 hours away at that point, as the delay was in his opinion impossible to reduce, as he now had to make arrangements for the care of about 4,000 French sailors. Signal dispatched, he went to bed with orders to the effect of, if the Admiralty or anyone else in London disagreed with his course of action, then he would give them a due reply once he woke up, and no sooner. Unfortunately, by 0700 on the morning of the 4th, London was the least of his concerns, as the final tragedy of Mers el-Kabir had played out, been reported back to Vichy France, and then reported on to Admiral Godefroy at some point overnight. A new letter thus awaited him, which was something of a change. In it, Godefroy renounced all previous commitments and avowed to fight his way to sea. Sure enough, with the dawn, the French ships were seen to be raising steam and clearing for action. Of course, whilst he'd been hoping for the best, Cunningham had prepared for the worst, and within minutes the British battleships had swung out and loaded their primary and secondary guns, whilst the destroyers and submarines were ordered to aim their torpedoes in such a way as to be ready to open fire the moment the French moved or opened fire themselves. Only one narrow window remained. Having gone cold to discharge fuel, it would take until early afternoon for the French fleet to raise enough steam to sail. With nothing else left to him, Cunningham ordered a signal composed and signalled directly to every French ship by every British ship, using searchlight, signal light, and radio, pointing out the terms that were offered by the British, the sincere desire by the Royal Navy not to have to fight the Marine Nationale, and postscripting it with the fact that with 4 battleships pre-aimed at point-blank range, any such fight, if it came to it, was going to be rather short and rather pointless from the French side of things. This message overall was then written on large blackboards, also written in French, and these were positioned on a number of ships' boats, which were then sailed along the line of anchored French warships. Finally, each French ship had a corresponding British ship that had been paired with them back in earlier and happier days. Each of these paired ships' captains was now ordered to go aboard their opposite number, with a translator if needed, to explain the situation personally to the French captains. This seemed to have a remarkable effect. One of the French cruisers immediately set its guns into travel positions and placed the tompions back in the muzzles. The French destroyers almost immediately ceased further preparation. It was hardly like they needed much prompting, so eager were they to get back in the fight, and various French sailors gathered on the decks of their ships in large numbers, with rather animated discussions being seen to take place. Various French captains were also seen heading for Godefroy's flagship at various points, apparently of their own volition. Gradually, work on the French ships slowed to a stop, and then just after lunch, all the French ships' captains were seen to be summoned back to the French flagship. An hour later, Godefroy signalled that he wished to come aboard Warspite. After some brief discussion, Godefroy indicated Warspite's 8 massive main guns and stated that he was yielding his fleet to overwhelming force. Both sides quickly agreed that the French ships would be defueled and disarmed immediately, and the crews somewhat reduced, with final manning requirements to await further discussion. A tragedy even greater than that at Mers el-Kabir had been avoided by the narrowest of margins. Cunningham then sent off a signal informing the Admiralty that the situation was now resolved. Hours later, he received personal replies from the First Lord and the First Sea Lord, offering their sincerest congratulations on his achievements in resolving the situation without bloodshed. Over the next few years, Godefroy remained mostly aboard his flagship, but, as Cunningham noted, no British success went without a letter of congratulation, and no ship was lost without a letter of sympathy arriving aboard Warspite. As one example, in May 1941, Godefroy would write that it was a pity his fleet could not help in repelling the bombing assaults on Alexandria, but if any enemy bombers were in any way perceived to be attacking the French ships, he would of course then be forced to reply with the full complement of his anti-aircraft guns. As it turned out, Cunningham's prediction was right, even if a few years in the making. Almost 3 years later, in May 1943, the Cross of Lorraine would be raised aboard the French ships in Alexandria harbour, and they sailed into battle once again, now as part of the Free French Navy. Some of them, including the battleship Lorraine herself, even got to help liberate their homeland, supporting the Allied invasion of southern France. More immediately, though, With the situation in Alexandria resolved, Cunningham could now head out to deal with the Regia Marina. The first thing on his list was Malta, which the Navy felt should be held at all costs. The Army and the Air Force were rather less convinced of this, though, thanks to conflicting priorities by different authorities, civil, naval, army, etc. Malta was already running short of supplies. After speaking with the governor, it was agreed that the first thing to do would be to get any remaining sailors' families away, including Cunningham's own, as this would reduce the demand on resources. Anyone on the island who wasn't vital to the island's defence, who had somewhere to go elsewhere and wished to leave, would also be removed for the same reason. A number of Italian prisoners of war, and as much of the built-up naval stock of supplies as possible, would also sail for Alexandria. 2 convoys would be formed, one fast and one slow, with the whole of the operational Mediterranean fleet mustered for cover. 3 battleships, an aircraft carrier, 5 cruisers, and 17 destroyers duly set out. They now came under air attack repeatedly, although only one major hit was actually scored. This destroyed the bridge of the cruiser Gloucester and killed 18 men, including her captain. Cunningham made a note that whilst high-altitude level bombing was generally ineffective, it seemed to him that certain Italian squadrons, presumably trained for anti-shipping work, were much more accurate in the placement of their bombs than the general offerings of the Regia Aeronautica. 34 separate attack waves came after Warspite in 4 days, with over 400 individual bombs being counted exploding around them. And that was just the forces directed at the flagship and her attendant destroyers, to say nothing of the rest of the fleet. By July the 8th, an enemy force of 2 battleships, 6 cruisers and 7 destroyers was reported covering an Italian convoy that was heading either to or from Libya, and so a diversion was made to try and cut them off from Taranto. This would in turn lead to the Battle of Calabria, which will require its own separate video, but was notable for Warspite scoring an extremely long-range hit on the Giulio Cesare, while one of her scouting aircraft parked itself over the Italian flagship, where it refused to be shot out of the sky by any amount of Italian anti-aircraft fire, and spent the rest of the day passing back sarcastic comments on the Italian fleet's current status, much to the amusement of all on Warspite's bridge. The Italian ships withdrew under the cover of smoke, handing the job of dealing with the Royal Navy back to their colleagues in the Regia Aeronautica, who proceeded to deplete the Mediterranean's fish population some more, but without much other result. Although Cunningham noted that in these early days, the better squadrons would often manage to get their bombs so close that ships would vanish in pillars of water, only to emerge moments later somehow unharmed. An accuracy that he noted degraded somewhat later in the war once Fleet Air-Arm fighters and better anti-aircraft fire control began to take their toll. Although initially the plan had been to delay the sailing of the convoys until the fleet reached Malta after this diversion, the Vice Admiral in command of Malta had wisely concluded that with the Regia Marina and Regia Aeronautica fighting the Mediterranean fleet, their attention would not be on Malta, and so he dispatched the fast convoy anyway. Some of Warspite's escort raced ahead to catch up with the fast convoy, whilst slower vessels like Royal Sovereign stuck with the slow convoy. Much bombing attended the return journey as well, although once more to no effect apart from a few casualties from a near miss on Liverpool. Warspite actually beat the fast convoy back to Alexandria, passing it in the night unseen as both parties had their lights off. This, of course, meant a happy family reunion the following morning, especially since when the convoy had arrived, Mrs. Cunningham had been worried to see Warspite heeled over at quite an alarming degree, which in itself has been used by some as part of so-called evidence for a rather ingenious conspiracy theory that Giulio Cesare had apparently also hit Warspite at Calabria, and this was somehow, and for reasons unknown, covered up by the British ever since. In fact, Cunningham himself noted that the heel on Warspite was being done deliberately by the controlled flooding of various tanks aboard, as the list meant that it was much easier to check if the bulges had been damaged by near misses from all of the bombing. Meanwhile, an assessment of Calabria and the convoy action was being sent off, pointing out that neither Royal Sovereign nor Malaya could match Warspite for gun range or speed, which complicated matters if, as at Calabria, Warspite found itself the only British heavy ship holding off various Italian battleships and heavy cruisers on behalf of the rest of the Mediterranean fleet. Ideally, they needed another ship like her, or better, plus some 8-inch cruisers and an armoured aircraft carrier with plenty of fighters. Shortly thereafter, HMAS Sydney turned the tables on a pair of Italian cruisers that were chasing some British destroyers, sinking the cruiser Bartolomeo Colleoni, whilst Swordfish from Eagle, failing to find the other cruiser, attacked some Italian merchant ships in Tobruk harbour instead during a follow-up sweep. When Eagle wasn't at sea, some of her Swordfish would operate from a land-based airfield, picking up a steady tally of ships hit over time. July passed with relatively little other drama, rounding off with the news that the carrier Illustrious would be coming to play, along with the battleship Valiant and a pair of C-class cruisers that had been converted to the anti-aircraft role. This was just as well as every battleship in the Mediterranean fleet, with the exception of Warspite, was pretty much on its last legs. Malaya's condensers were playing up as she could only periodically reach her top speed, and Ramillies and Royal Sovereign's boilers were dying alarmingly quickly, albeit given their age and the time since their last refit, this was perhaps not unexpected. Also arriving was the welcome profile of the County-class heavy cruiser HMS Kent, although she only lasted about a month in theatre, arriving with the other reinforcements in August and having to be withdrawn in mid-September after being torpedoed in the stern by a torpedo bomber. The arrival of Illustrious and Valiant was especially welcome, for with them came the latest radar, a friend for Warspite, and a contingent of Fulmar fighters, who quickly began knocking out the various Italian long-range patrol aircraft that had dogged every movement Cunningham had made thus far, and had a nasty habit of summoning bombers. It also meant the start of planning for a raid on the Italian battle fleet in its home port of Taranto. By mid-September, the Italian advance from their holdings into Egypt had slowly begun, and destroyers, gunboats, and HMS Terror were assigned to bombard any Italian troop concentrations or other targets within range of the coast to try and help slow them down. By the end of the month, several thousand troops were embarked on 2 cruisers to reinforce Malta. The A-team of the fleet, including Warspite, Valiant and Illustrious, sailed to escort them, this force being made up essentially of the faster ships, whilst Malaya, Ramillies, Eagle and other slower ships became the B-team. Recon aircraft from Illustrious spotted an Italian fleet, but these ships did not attempt to interfere with Cunningham's mission, and the troops were landed to the there-and-back accompaniment of the Regia Aeronautica's level bombing attempts. A destroyer depot ship, 4 destroyers and the battleship Barham were scheduled to arrive as the next wave of reinforcements, and planning for another Malta convoy run in October was being undertaken. The government now sent another entirely useless signal trying to prod the Mediterranean fleet into more offensive action now they had Illustrious and Valiant, to which Cunningham replied that he'd already made it clear that he also needed long-range aerial recon, since without that he had no idea where the Italian fleet was on any given day in order to try and fight it, and that to maintain convoys as well as a large-scale fleet offensives required far more destroyers than he was currently given. And if no more destroyers were forthcoming, which he understood given the pressing concerns of war elsewhere, at least some corvettes or other craft suitable for convoy work should be sent to free up the destroyers from that role. The early October convoy to Malta went off without incident, covered by the whole fleet. A series of thunderstorms appeared which seemed to put off the Regia Aeronautica, and if the Regia Marina sorted, no one saw any sign of them. Although a small return convoy led to a spirited action between the Ajax and a mixed force of Italian torpedo boats and destroyers, the former being large ocean-capable craft which would have been classed as destroyers in World War I, not something like a PT boat. Ajax managed to sink the Arione and Ariel and damaged the Artiglieri, which would be finished off the next day by HMS York. Although Ajax didn't get away entirely scot-free, her superstructure being somewhat shot up by return fire, with the action highlighting the need for flashless charges for night actions, as the cruiser had struggled occasionally with the flash of her own guns blinding her gun layers. The return of the fleet to Alexandria proved quite spectacular. The carriers had bombed the airfield on Leros on the way back, and in exchange other Italian torpedo bombers had counterattacked. The battleships drove off their attackers, but one of the aircraft managed to hit the cruiser Liverpool in the bow. This led to a series of explosions which partially blew the bow away. The cruiser Orion got a tow going, but the lines parted after about 100 miles of tow. They tried again, what was left of Liverpool's bow fell off, and the job was suddenly a lot easier. However, this was only the prelude. That night, under a full moon, at about 0100 in the morning, the fleet arrived at Alexandria in the middle of a full air raid on the port, along with another strike launched by torpedo bombers on the fleet. Cunningham ran his forces at full speed over the Great Pass, an area of shallow water at the entrance to the harbour, since this would in theory swallow most aerial torpedoes as they plunged deep on their initial drop into the water. With the fleet racing into the harbour with glowing phosphorescent wakes and guns going off on all sides as they engaged the half-seen shapes of both sets of Regia Aeronautica aircraft. By this point, Vice Admiral Tovey had been recalled and would take up his position in the home fleet, leaving Cunningham with a new second-in-command in the shape of Rear Admiral Pridham Whipple, breveted to Vice Admiral and a friend from the Dardanelles operations back in World War I. Cunningham spent most of his time aboard Warspite, even in harbour, except for afternoons there where he enjoyed a game of golf or tennis, and moonless nights where the lack of air raids meant he could come ashore to dine with his wife at their residence. The other services asked if he might relocate to Cairo, but he was determined that as long as he had a flagship and the prospect of enemy action, he would remain with it on the front lines, whatever the circumstances. Instead, he designated a trusted subordinate to directly liaise with the other two services and remain in Cairo on his behalf. The end of October brought the Italian ultimatum to Greece and their subsequent attack, which meant the Mediterranean fleet now had to rapidly take control of Crete and prepare for the inevitable demands to reinforce Greece itself. Within a couple of days, a base was being established in Suda Bay, and the fleet was dealing with the air raids that were trying to stop them. Meanwhile, the attack on Taranto was finally ready to go. Originally, Cunningham had wanted to launch the raid on the 21st of October, Trafalgar Day, but a fire in Illustrious's hangar meant the next suitable moon wouldn't be until November the 11th, which turned out to be just as well, as aerial reconnaissance in the interim revealed the location of barrage balloons and torpedo nets. Eagle was supposed to join in, but on the 9th she developed issues with her aircraft fueling systems, and so her contribution could only be by sending over some of her swordfish to Illustrious. A great plan was devised to cover the attacks. Barham, Glasgow and Berwick with escorts would sail east as reinforcements for the Mediterranean fleet. The bulk of the existing Mediterranean fleet's capital ships would be covering a convoy that was heading west to Malta. Cruisers were sent to sweep north, a convoy was sent from Malta back to Alexandria, and other operations were undertaken, such as a raid on the Straits of Otranto. All in all, there was more than enough going on across the breadth of the Mediterranean to occupy any recon aircraft's attention, and would hopefully allow Illustrious to slip away north unnoticed. And so it proved. Thanks to the recon work a few days before, the Swordfish swept in overland, bypassed the torpedo nets, and damaged 3 Italian battleships along with some smaller warships in exchange for the loss of 2 aircraft. The cruiser raid also managed to net most of an Italian convoy, and Regia Aeronautica attempts at retaliation failed as Illustrious's fighter complement, guided by radar, shot down 3 scouting flying boats in quick succession, denying the Regia Aeronautica the location of their targets. With a reduced threat from the Italian battle fleet, the Mediterranean fleet could in turn relax a little, and with the arrival of Barham, the badly worn-out Malaya and Ramillies could go home for refits. Relax didn't mean rest, though. Convoys to Greece and Crete needed escorting, the Italian bombing of Alexandria stepped up a notch, and in an odd twist, this was more of a problem when the fleet was away. When it was there, between the fleet's radar and their anti-aircraft batteries, the raids were generally broken up. But when the fleet was away, the shore-based radar and anti-aircraft guns seemed to enjoy significantly poorer results, and appeared generally badly organised. The fleet's protests to this effect would lead to a gradual improvement on matters in this respect, although it took a while. The defences around Suda Bay were also progressing, but it was not safe to use as a forward operating base. The torpedoing by aircraft of the Glasgow was proof enough of that. She had to limp back to Alexandria for temporary repairs and then on home for full repairs as a result, but it was currently useful as a resupply and refuelling area. With Greece currently holding its own against the Italians, the British army preparing to advance in the desert, and the Regia Marina generally still cautious in the immediate aftermath of Taranto, things seemed to be on the upswing. A big convoy was run from the UK to Gibraltar, Malta and Alexandria, with its passing marked by the inconclusive Battle of Cape Spartivento, which was the greatest threat the convoy ended up facing. For the first time, Warspite completed a convoy run, picking up the ships from Malta and heading to Alexandria, without having to fire a shot in her own defence. The end of November and then December 1940 were dominated by two major factors in Cunningham's sphere. First was a running battle to dissuade London from ordering them to try and capture Pantellaria, a tiny island in the middle of the Narrows between Sicily and Tunisia. Quite why anyone thought this was a good idea was beyond Cunningham. It would be even harder to supply than Malta. It was closer to Italian airfields, it had no large natural harbour, a hostile population, and no native fresh water supplies. This he managed to fend off long enough for other events to overtake and cancel it early in the following year. The other major issue was an attempt by some in London to get Admiral Somerville dismissed via a board of inquiry, simply because the Battle of Cape Spartivento was not a decisive victory. Regardless of the fact that with a single battlecruiser, Renown, and the old slow Ramillies, Somerville had no way of actually catching the Italian ships with anything close to reasonable firepower. Sure, he could have gone solo after them with Renown, but given that that would be Renown versus Giulia Cesare and Vittorio Veneto at the same time, this was clearly a foolish idea. Cunningham sent his own ideas on the subject to the First Sea Lord. You ask me if I was surprised at the Board of Inquiry on Force H's action south of Sardinia. You will wish me to speak out quite frankly and say I was very sorry for that decision, more especially as the board was set up even before Force H had returned to harbour. The action was an unsatisfactory one. When one is burdened with a convoy, one's hands are always tied to a certain extent. Of course, the Fleet Air Arm got no hits, although they claim to have done so, and it is obvious that all the enemy ships had the legs of Force H. At the time, I thought it intolerable that a flag officer, doing his utmost in difficult circumstances, should be continuously under the threat of finding a board of inquiry waiting for him on his return to harbour if his actions failed to commend themselves to those at home who knew little or nothing of the real facts of the case. Such prejudgment is not the best way to get loyal service. I might add that the Board of Inquiry came to a decision entirely favourable to the flag officer commanding Force H. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you write an old-school English letter that's dripping with sarcasm and not quite so veiled invective to a superior officer without getting yourself court-martialed. Most of the rest of December 1940 was dominated by the army advancing on land, with support from the Monitor Terror, a variety of small gunboats, and the Scrap Iron Flotilla, which also covered the movement of numerous supply ships, which were proving much easier in terms of ways to get portable supplies to the front lines than the increasingly lengthy paths through the desert. In Cunningham's view, though, even more important than the material success on the ground was the fact that this offensive had actually got all three services working together in concert for a change. There was also convoy escort to be done, a shore bombardment mission which unfortunately had relatively little result thanks to some intervening mountains blocking the ability to observe the fall of shot, and then a brief visit by Admiral Cunningham and HMS Warspite to Malta, which was received with much acclaim. As the month ground on, over in North Africa, the Army's supply lines continued to stretch and stretch and stretch, and whilst the naval forces assigned were doing their level best to bypass the roads in an even bigger way via the use of various ports that were captured en route, it was hoped that the existing supply train could hold out at least until the Army captured Tobruk, which, with its much, much larger harbour, would make a fine forward resupply base. Thus ended 1940, and with it our narrative of Admiral Cunningham's career for the moment. Next time, we'll move forward with Cunningham as the Luftwaffe arrives in the Mediterranean, and things start to get really serious on all fronts as the Regia Aeronautica, Fliegerkorps 10, and the Regia Mariner all conspire to make his life exceptionally difficult.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.